April 5th, 2006. USP Pollock, Louisiana. One man, one shipping crate, 12 hours of freedom. And the craziest part, he mailed himself out, like a package. Richard Lee McNair was serving 2 life sentences plus 30 years for murder at a federal maximum security prison. On the morning of April 5th, he climbed into a pallet of mailbags in the prison workshop and was delivered to freedom. But this isn't just a story about hiding in a box. It's about the months of planning to get that mailroom job. The traffic stop where he talked his way past a cop who knew an escaped convict was nearby. And the year and a half he spent outsmarting authorities across 2 countries. 10 months after his escape, a police officer pulled him over on a Louisiana back road. McNair talked for 10 minutes. Convinced the cop he was just a construction worker out for a jog, the officer let him go. 2 hours later, that officer learned he'd just released America's most wanted fugitive. This is how one of the most ingenious prison escapes in American history succeeded, because a killer could talk his way out of anything. Richard Lee McNair wasn't always a prisoner. He was a United States Air Force sergeant, polite, intelligent, well-spoken, the kind of person you'd trust to watch your house while you were on vacation. But McNair led a double life. By day, he served his country. By night, he burglarized businesses across North Dakota. Small offices, warehouses, grain elevators. Nothing violent, just theft, quick cash. He thought he had it under control. How does a respected Air Force sergeant become a burglar? Boredom, greed, arrogance. Maybe all 3. Until February 1987. McNair broke into a grain warehouse office in Minot, North Dakota. Late at night, thought the place was empty. It wasn't. 2 men surprised him inside. One was a security guard. The other was Jerry Thies, a truck driver who'd stopped by. McNair panicked. He had a gun. He opened fire. The security guard was wounded, but survived. Jerry Thies wasn't as lucky. He died at the scene. McNair fled. Police caught him within days. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, ballistics, McNair's own confession. The judge sentenced him to 2 life sentences, plus additional time for attempted murder. No possibility of parole. He would die in prison. McNair was 47 years old at the time of his 3rd escape, but his criminal career had begun nearly 20 years earlier with that fatal shooting. And in those 20 years, he'd already escaped twice before. The first escape happened almost immediately after his arrest. 1988, McNair was being held at a police station in Minot. He was handcuffed, waiting for transfer to prison. A detective stepped out of the room for just a moment. McNair saw his chance. He'd smuggled a small container of lip balm in his pocket. He squeezed it onto his wrists, used it as lubricant, started working his hand through the cuff, twisting, pulling. The metal cut into his skin. He didn't care. One hand slipped free, then the other. He ran to the window. 3rd floor, 30 feet down to concrete. He didn't hesitate, jumped, landed hard, broke bones, got up anyway, ran. Police caught him the same day, hobbling through town, injured, exhausted. His first escape lasted less than 6 hours. But it taught him something important. Speed wasn't enough. He needed better planning. Would he get another chance to try? The second escape came 4 years later. 1992, North Dakota State Penitentiary. McNair and 2 other inmates discovered a ventilation duct in their cell block. The duct led outside. They spent weeks loosening the grate, working quietly at night, scraping away decades-old concrete. December 1992, freezing North Dakota winter. They made their move. All 3 inmates crawled through the duct, out onto the prison roof, down to the ground, into the darkness. They split up immediately, better odds that way. McNair stayed free for 10 months. He drifted across the country, changed his appearance, grew a beard, wore glasses, altered his walk, used fake names, worked odd jobs for cash, never stayed in one place too long. He made it all the way to Nebraska before police caught him. Someone recognized him from a wanted poster, called it in. Officers surrounded the house where he was staying. McNair surrendered without a fight. His second escape ended after 10 months of freedom. That's when authorities realized McNair was different, not violent during escapes, but relentless, calculating, patient. he would never stop trying. They transferred him to ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal supermax prison, the most secure facility in America. 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Concrete walls, steel doors, camera surveillance everywhere. ADX. Florence was built to hold terrorists and cartel leaders, men who could never be allowed to escape. McNair knew he couldn't break out of ADX. The security was simply too tight. So how do you escape from the most secure prison in America? You don't. You trick them into transferring you somewhere less secure. He played a different game. For 3 years, McNair became a model prisoner. No fights, no disciplinary reports, no incidents. He took classes, read books, followed every rule. Prison psychologists evaluated him, wrote reports saying he'd matured, that he'd accepted his fate. It was all an act. McNair was patient. He waited. He petitioned for transfer to a regular maximum security prison, argued that ADX was unnecessarily harsh for someone who'd reformed. His lawyers pushed the request. Prison officials reviewed his record. In 2005, they approved the transfer. Richard McNair was moved to USP Pollock in Louisiana, a maximum security federal prison, still heavily guarded, still surrounded by fences and razor wire, but not ADX Florence. To prison officials, Pollock seemed secure enough. To McNair, it was a hunting ground. How do you escape from a maximum security federal prison surrounded by armed guards and surveillance cameras? McNair spent his first months at Pollock studying the facility, guard routines, camera blind spots, shift changes, delivery schedules. He watched everything, memorized everything. He volunteered for the prison's manufacturing program. Inmates repaired old mailbags for the United States Postal Service. Canvas bags, heavy stitching, routine work, boring, repetitive. Perfect. McNair worked in the mailbag workshop near the prison's perimeter, day after day, sewing, repairing, and watching. What could a pile of canvas bags possibly have to do with freedom? McNair was about to find out. He noticed something crucial. Pallets of repaired mailbags were wrapped in plastic shrink wrap, loaded onto forklifts, taken to a warehouse outside the main prison fence. There, they waited for postal service trucks to pick them up. Outside the main fence, that was the key. If he could hide inside one of those pallets, the prison would literally ship him out. The guards would deliver him to freedom themselves. But the execution had to be perfect. McNair spent months preparing. Every detail mattered. One mistake and he'd be caught, thrown in solitary, transferred back to ADX. He'd never get another chance. First, he studied the pallet configuration. How many mailbags fit on each one? How they were stacked? How much space was inside? He measured everything with his eyes, memorized the dimensions. He needed to create a hollow space inside a pallet, big enough for him to fit, hidden enough that no one would notice, sturdy enough that it wouldn't collapse when more bags were piled on top. Second, he gathered materials, scraps of plastic, packaging materials, a thin tube for breathing. He took small items over weeks, nothing that would be missed, hid them in his cell. He fashioned a crude breathing tube from plastic tubing, just wide enough for air to pass through, long enough to reach from the center of a pallet to the outside. Without it, he'd suffocate under the shrink wrap. Would a homemade tube really give him enough air? He'd only find out when it was too late to turn back. Third, he prepared his disguise. He couldn't escape in prison clothing, too obvious, too recognizable. He needed civilian clothes. He smuggled gym shorts and a tank top from the recreation area, running shoes from the donation bin, normal clothing, the kind a jogger would wear. He could put them on under his prison uniform, shed the uniform at the last moment. Fourth, he needed cutting tools. Once inside the pallet and wrapped in plastic, he'd be trapped. He needed a way to cut himself out. He stole a razor blade from the workshop, small, easy to hide, sharp enough to slice through shrink wrap. He taped it inside his waistband. By early April 2006, everything was ready. He just needed the right moment. April 5th, 2006, morning shift. McNair reported to the mailbag workshop as usual, clocked in, started repairing bags, acting completely normal. He'd studied the schedule, He knew the forklift operator came by around 11:30 a.m. to collect finished pallets. He knew most workers left for lunch between 11:15 and 11:30, a brief window when the workshop was nearly empty. That was his moment. 11:15 a.m. Workers started filtering out for lunch. Guards supervised the main exit, counting heads, making sure everyone went to the cafeteria. McNair volunteered to finish up a last stack of bags. "I'll catch up in a few minutes," he told the guard. The guard nodded. McNair was a model prisoner, trustworthy, no reason to worry. The workshop emptied. McNair was alone. He moved fast. He stripped off his prison uniform. Underneath, he wore the gym shorts and tank top. He stuffed the uniform behind a workbench, out of sight. He climbed onto the prepared pallet, the one he'd been working on for weeks. The hollow space was in the center, surrounded by mailbags on all sides, hidden from view. McNair squeezed himself into the space, curled into a fetal position, his knees pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped tight around his legs. The canvas bags pressed against him from every direction. He pulled additional bags over the opening above him, buried himself completely, found the end of his breathing tube, put it in his mouth. Now he had to wait, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Any movement could shift the bags, any noise could alert someone. The air inside was stale. It smelled of canvas and machine oil. Sweat trickled down his face. His legs cramped. He couldn't move to stretch them. What if someone noticed the pallet looked wrong? What if they checked inside? What if the breathing tube got blocked? 11:30 a.m. Right on schedule. The forklift entered the workshop. McNair heard the engine, felt the vibration through the concrete floor. The driver whistled, casual, bored. Just another routine pickup. The forklift approached McNair's pallet. Metal forks slid underneath. The pallet lifted. McNair felt the sensation of movement, rising, tilting slightly, moving forward. He didn't breathe, didn't move. The breathing tube provided just enough air, barely. Through a tiny gap between the bags, he caught a sliver of daylight. The forklift was leaving the building, heading toward the warehouse, outside the main fence. The journey took less than 5 minutes. It felt like hours. The forklift set the pallet down. McNair heard voices, warehouse workers, moving around, organizing deliveries. He stayed perfectly still. After what felt like an eternity, the voices faded. Lunchtime. The workers left. The warehouse grew quiet. McNair waited another 10 minutes, making sure he was truly alone. Then he moved. He pulled out the razor blade, started cutting through the shrink wrap from the inside, carefully, quietly. The plastic gave way slowly. He made a slit big enough to squeeze through, pushed aside the mailbags, climbed out. He was in the warehouse, outside the main prison fence. No guards, no cameras pointed at him, just an open loading bay door 30 feet away. He stood there for a moment, breathing real air, looking at the woods beyond the prison compound. And then he was out. The loading bay, the open sky, the Louisiana sun on his face. For the first time in nearly 20 years, no walls, no bars, no guards counting heads. Just the smell of pine trees, just the feel of grass under his feet, just freedom. Then he ran. Out the loading bay, across the yard, into the tree line. He didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran, putting distance between himself and the prison. But he wasn't free yet, not really. How long before the entire state of Louisiana would be hunting him? McNair ran through the woods for over an hour, following railroad tracks, heading north, staying away from roads where police might be patrolling. Back at the prison, a warehouse employee returned from lunch around 1 p.m. He noticed a pallet with cut plastic, mailbags scattered. Something was wrong. The alarm went out immediately. Sirens blared. Every available officer mobilized. Roadblocks set up. Helicopters requested. The manhunt began. But McNair had a head start. Nearly 2 hours. Would it be enough? That would make all the difference. By 2 p.m., McNair had covered several miles on foot. He emerged from the woods onto a back road near the town of Ball, Louisiana. He was dressed like a jogger. Shorts, tank top, running shoes, sweaty from the heat, but looking completely normal. That's when Officer Carl Bordelon drove past. The officer had just received an alert. Escaped prisoner from Pollock, white male, similar height and build. Bordelon slowed his cruiser, looked at the jogger. Could be him, could be nothing. Would one officer's gut instinct be enough to catch America's most wanted? He pulled over, got out, approached the man. "Hold up a second," the officer called out. McNair stopped, caught his breath, looked relaxed, friendly even. "What are you doing out here?" Bordelon asked. McNair smiled. "Just out for a run, officer. I'm in town doing construction work, helping with houses damaged by Hurricane Katrina." His voice was calm, casual, like he'd been asked this question 100 times before. Bordelon studied him. "You know, you match the description of that escaped prisoner." McNair didn't flinch. "Oh yeah? Well, I'm Robert Jones. My friends call me Jimmy." The mismatched names gave Bordelon pause. Robert or Jimmy? Which was it? He radioed dispatch, requested details about the escaped inmate, a photo if possible. While waiting, he kept McNair talking. They made small talk, the weather, hurricane reconstruction, casual conversation. McNair spoke so naturally, so effortlessly, that Bordelon started to doubt his suspicions. This guy seemed normal, friendly, just a construction worker out for a jog. After about 10 minutes, dispatch faxed a photo, but the quality was poor, grainy, hard to make out details. Bordelon compared it to the man in front of him. Maybe? Maybe not? He made a decision. "All right, be careful out here, buddy." McNair nodded. "Will do, officer. Thanks." He continued jogging down the railroad tracks, easy pace, not rushed, just a regular guy out for exercise. Bordelon watched him go, got back in his cruiser, drove away. 2 hours later, Bordelon learned the truth. That jogger was Richard Lee McNair, the escaped convict, the man he'd been looking for, and he'd just let him walk away. How could a trained officer fail to recognize America's most wanted man standing 2 feet in front of him? The officer was devastated, mortified. He'd had America's most wanted fugitive right in front of him. They'd talked for 10 minutes, and McNair had convinced him, completely. That conversation saved McNair's life. Without it, he would have been caught within hours. Instead, he had time, space, a chance to really run. McNair slipped back into the woods after the encounter. He knew every cop in Louisiana would be hunting for him now. He needed to get out of the state, fast. Over the next few days, he moved carefully, traveled by night, hid during the day, stole a car from a rural area, drove north. Within a week, the U.S. Marshal Service placed McNair on their top 15 most wanted list. His mugshot appeared on America's Most Wanted. News outlets covered the story. The prisoner who mailed himself out of jail. McNair saw the coverage on TV. He knew he'd become too famous. His face was everywhere. Someone would recognize him eventually. He decided to leave the country. How do you cross an international border when your face is on every news channel? Late April 2006, McNair crossed into Canada, likely through a remote border crossing on foot, maybe through the woods in Montana or North Dakota, areas with minimal surveillance. He made it to British Columbia, Western Canada, purchased a stolen car using fake identification. April 28, 2006, Penticton, British Columbia. 2 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers approached a suspicious vehicle in a beach parking lot. The car was reported stolen. McNair was nearby. He saw the officers examining the car, realized it was over. "Stop, police!" one Mountie shouted. McNair ran, sprinted across a field, disappeared into nearby woods. The officers tried to chase him, but lost him quickly. They searched the car, found maps, fake IDs, a digital camera full of selfies, McNair in various disguises, wearing different clothes, different hairstyles. He'd been documenting his journey. 2 days later, one of the officers watched America's Most Wanted, saw McNair's face, realized who'd escaped from them. But by then, McNair was gone. For the next year and a half, McNair became a ghost. He traveled across Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Yukon. He even rode a stolen bicycle from British Columbia to Yukon at one point. Over 1,000 miles on a bike. staying off main roads, avoiding cameras. He snuck back into the United States briefly, then returned to Canada through remote areas. He spent time in vast woodlands, sometimes camping in the wilderness, sometimes staying in cheap motels under fake names. He grew a beard, shaved it, grew it again, wore glasses, changed his clothing style, altered his appearance constantly. McNair watched TV coverage of his own manhunt. He learned what clues authorities had, what leads they were following. He adjusted his movements accordingly. Once, in a Yukon Ranger station, a friendly warden offered him coffee. Behind the ranger, a wanted poster with McNair's face hung on a corkboard. McNair smiled, thanked the man, left quickly before recognition could dawn. How you drink coffee with your own wanted poster hanging 3 feet away. You don't flinch, you don't blink, you act like nothing is wrong. He lived carefully. He stole cars and license plates when needed, broke into vacant cabins for food, but he never hurt anyone. No violence, no confrontations. Despite being a convicted killer, McNair avoided any situation that could turn violent during his escape. This restraint earned him a strange kind of respect. The clever convict who escaped in a mailbag, who talked his way past a cop, who roamed free without spilling blood. But paranoia followed him everywhere. Every stranger's glance could be recognition. Every police car could be the end. By fall 2007, McNair had traveled thousands of miles. He'd spent over 18 months on the run, longer than his previous 2 escapes combined. He moved east across Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, maybe planning to catch a ship, maybe trying to reach Europe. But his luck finally ran out. October 25th, 2007, late evening. McNair was driving a stolen vehicle through rural New Brunswick. He didn't know local police had set up a random checkpoint ahead, checking for drunk drivers, routine traffic stop. McNair rolled up to the checkpoint. Officers asked for identification. The ID didn't check out. The name didn't match their database. Something about McNair's demeanor raised suspicions. One officer thought he looked familiar. They brought him in for fingerprinting. The prints confirmed his identity. Richard Lee McNair, America's most wanted fugitive, on the run for 1.5 years, caught at a random traffic checkpoint in Canada. McNair was cooperative during his arrest. After so long living on adrenaline and fear, perhaps part of him was relieved. The U.S. Marshals were notified immediately. They'd been hunting him for 18 months, across 2 countries, thousands of miles, and a random traffic stop finally ended it. McNair was extradited back to the United States. His 3rd escape was over. Prison officials were humiliated. A prisoner had mailed himself out of their facility, talked his way past a police officer during a manhunt, stayed free for over 1 year. It was a massive security failure. They were determined McNair would never get a 4th chance. He was transferred back to ADX Florence in Colorado, the Supermax facility he'd worked so hard to escape, back to solitary confinement. 23 hours a day in a tiny cell, concrete walls, steel doors, no windows, no contact with other inmates. McNair remains there today, in his mid-60s now. He'll spend the rest of his life in ADX. Barring some miracle, he'll die there. A senior U.S. Marshal who hunted McNair later admitted having professional respect for his cunning and determination. Years after the capture, the Marshal and McNair exchanged letters. Strange conversations between hunter and prey. McNair expressed admiration for the manhunt. The Marshal expressed amazement at McNair's escape artistry. "If I'd buckled my seatbelt that day, I'd be in Mexico right now," McNair joked after his capture, referring to the traffic stop that ended everything. In reality, his capture was inevitable. You can only run for so long. Eventually, luck runs out. But McNair holds a unique distinction. He's the only prisoner in American history known to successfully escape from a city jail, a state penitentiary, and a federal maximum security prison. 3 different facilities, 3 different security levels, 3 successful escapes. No one else has ever done that. The mailbag escape remains one of the most creative prison breaks in history. It required patience, planning, nerve, and perfect execution. One guard checking the pallet, one worker noticing the hollow space. One mistake anywhere in the process, and McNair would have been caught immediately. But everything went right. The timing, the forklift, the empty warehouse, the head start, even the police encounter on the road. McNair proved something that terrifies prison officials everywhere, that with enough intelligence, patience, and planning, even maximum security facilities have weaknesses. Even federal prisons can be breached. After his escape, USP Pollock overhauled their security procedures. The mailbag program was shut down. Inmate work assignments near the perimeter were restricted. Pallet shipments were inspected more carefully. Security protocols were tightened across the federal prison system. All because one man climbed into a pile of canvas bags and was shipped to freedom. Today, at ADX Florence, McNair paces his cell, 23 steps from door to wall, 23 steps back, counting, always counting. Because a man who escaped 3 times hasn't completely quit believing lightning might strike a 4th time. To this day, law enforcement officials study McNair's escapes. What went wrong? How he succeeded? What can be learned? His case is taught in federal prison training programs as an example of inmate ingenuity and institutional failure. The mailbag escape is particularly studied. How did one inmate prepare such an elaborate escape without anyone noticing? How did he gather materials? How did he test his plan? How did the prison allow such a vulnerability to exist? Those questions led to systemic changes, better oversight of inmate work programs, stricter tool control, more frequent searches, enhanced surveillance of shipping and receiving areas. McNair's legacy is permanent changes to how America's prisons operate. His escapes exposed weaknesses that had existed for decades and forced the system to adapt. But in his cell at ADX Florence, none of that matters. McNair has 23 steps, concrete walls, steel doors, and the rest of his life to remember what freedom tasted like. For 18 months, he was free. He saw mountains, forests, open sky. He traveled thousands of miles. He lived by his wits. He outsmarted everyone chasing him. Then, a random traffic checkpoint ended it all. Remember that mailbag workshop? The one he volunteered for? The one he spent months studying? That single job assignment turned a maximum security federal prison into a post office and shipped one of America's most wanted men to freedom. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.